Welcome to Living Western, a show dedicated to telling the real story of the rural American West through individual stories of the amazing people who call this part of the world home. Thank you for joining me, folks, on this very first episode of the Living Western podcast. My name is Clayton Marxer. Episode number 1, Clash of Cultures. This first episode is going to be an introduction into the podcast. I'm going to try and share with you what the podcast is about, who it's for, but really the meat of it is I want to share the why behind this podcast. Right now in our culture, there is an interest in cowboys and Western culture that we have never before seen in history. And a lot of that is spurred by something as simple as a TV show. The Yellowstone TV show has captivated the minds of millions of people all over the world. And if you combine that with other factors like the COVID pandemic and readily accessible high-speed internet in these remote areas, people are starting to see a glimpse of a different life. People in urban cultures, suburban cultures, people outside of the sphere of the rural American West, they are starting to get a glimpse and a dream of our part of the world. They love the idea of the cowboy life. They love the idea of Montana and some of these other Western states with a romantic association attached to them. They love the idea of our freedom that we have out here. But there's not a lot of reality that they are being exposed to about our life out here in the West. And I want to try and shed a light on that. And I'm not trying to build a fluff piece with this podcast. I'm not trying to just share all the warm fuzzies and the bright lights and the romance of what life in the rural American West is all about. I also want to share the harsh realities, the truth. Now, where are people consuming their information? Specifically, where are people in these urban, suburban communities? And I'm going to refer to these folks as city folks, not in any negative way at all, but just as a way of kind of labeling them so that we all understand who the parties are here in this clash of cultures. And if we're talking about the urban folks, the city folks, where are they getting their information about Western culture, about what cowboys and romantic illusions of Montana? Where are they getting those? They're getting those from popular culture. They're getting those from the Yellowstone TV show and from lots of other media. If that's where they get their information, then that's where they base their knowledge. That's what their perception of reality is. And I feel like it's important at this stage in history, at this point in all of our lives, to try to find a way to share the realities of the rural American life with them. Because you cannot appreciate what you don't have any concept of. What I mean by that is I'm a firm believer that if you know somebody's story, if you've listened to somebody's story, it's much harder to hate them or dismiss them. Now, you don't have to agree with them. You don't have to agree with everybody. But if you know somebody's why they believe the way they do, you can at least respect them. You might not agree with their opinion, but you can respect it. You can understand their point of view. And with that, there's a little bit more understanding. There's a little bit of consideration for what that person may have gone through or why they might feel the way that they do. Maybe they're right about something that you've never considered before, but none of those are options if you don't first hear the story. So The Living Western podcast is going to be all about that. I want to help share the story, the grand story of the rural American West. And the best way I can think of to do that is to let the characters and the people who live out here tell those stories themselves. So, the Living Western podcast is going to be an interview based conversational podcast. I hope to build eventually a weekly podcast out of this. Initially, the goal is going to be 2 podcasts a month, and I'm going to bring in interesting people, people with uh, a real good story, but a real story. And not everybody that's going to be interviewed on this show is going to be a cowboy or anybody from Western culture that wears a cowboy hat. Predominantly, yeah, most of the guests are probably going to be from my culture. But there are people that live out here in the West who are not part of the ranching and cowboy community. They are conservationists. They are recreationists. They're writers. They're authors. There are any number of industries that they're involved in that aren't ranching, but they do call the American West home. And I'm going to share their stories as well because it's all tied together. It's all part of the culture of the rural American West. So that is the why behind the podcast. I really think that it's important at this point in our lives and in societies. Uh, the position in our history. I think it's important to start trying to communicate our messages across barriers. It's very easy when we don't understand something to isolate ourselves to what we do understand. And when we do that, we get pretty protective of what we understand and we live in our own little sphere because we understand it. And those who are outside of that sphere, we tend to just kind of dismiss because they don't think like us. There needs to be a bridge because we all need each other. Those of you who live in these cities, large metropolitan areas, where your life is completely dependent on a grocery store, you need to have an understanding of where your food and fiber comes from. Someday, those grocery stores might be empty. And at that point in time, you're going to be wishing that you'd had a better understanding of where food comes from, how it's produced, and how it gets to you. This podcast is about sharing that story. Those of you who live in urban culture, you need to be able to understand where the wide open spaces and the natural resources and the wildlife, what is keeping all of that intact. And it's not all government programs and national parks. I can tell you that. Predominantly, those natural resources that you all love to watch on TV, all the wide open vistas that you get to go through before you even get to the park, those are protected via industries like ranching. Large landowners producing food and fiber to be consumed by everybody. They are the ones keeping most of this rural Western landscape open for the wildlife and for us. So I want to help share that story. I want you as city folks to be able to appreciate what it takes for the people who live out here to be able to put food on your plate. What it takes for them to be able to make a living and keep these communities functioning, these tourism communities functioning and vibrant for you to come visit. It takes a lot. And I think it's time that we start sharing that story a little bit better. Those of us in the Western culture are pretty good at telling stories. We're real good at telling stories. But unfortunately, we're best at telling stories to our own culture, to our own people, people who understand us, people who can easily appreciate our stories. I want this podcast to be bigger than that. Yes, I definitely want my peers in Western culture to be able to appreciate and value this podcast and to really enjoy it. But I also think it's very important that those of you who are outside of our culture can glean something from the interviews that you're going to hear on this podcast and come away with a better understanding of our land, our culture, our people, our resources, and how they all affect you. Let me introduce myself and tell a little bit of my story. Like I mentioned earlier, my name is Clayton Marxer. I am a lifelong cowboy and conservationist. I was born in Montana and right into the ranching life. At 6 weeks old, I was riding a pillow in front of my mom on a horse moving cows. We lived in a wild, remote portion of the expansive Matador Cattle Company, the division of the ranch that my dad managed at that point in time was called Sage Creek, and it was about 80,000 acres of nothing but sagebrush hills and grass. There's like 3 pastures with 80,000 acres. And we were probably 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. So that creates some issues when it comes to childcare. Now, in this day and age, we all are struggling with childcare. Those of us who are parents trying to work multiple jobs we definitely understand that. But when I was a baby, that was a concern back then as well. And it wasn't so much finding a good babysitter as it was just finding a babysitter. So necessity caused me to be riding horses before I could even walk. And by 2 years old, I had my own Shetland pony and I was out moving cows with dad, riding by myself. By the age of 10, I probably had 10,000 miles horseback, at least. I grew up in a saddle. Ranching was all I had ever known until I left for college at 18 years old. I went to Wyoming to study ag business. And after I got that degree, I jumped headlong into adult life, ranching, and I loved my life. Um, it was very easy to step into something that was all I'd ever known. It was scary to step outside of that. And for several years after college, I ranched and I ranched on some places that were among the biggest in the world. And I've also ranched on small family outfits. I've cowboyed on commercial outfits and I've cowboyed on registered outfits. Now, those of you who are in our culture know what I'm talking about. A commercial herd is cows that are born and bred and raised for beef consumption, and the registered animals are the ones that are raised to create the genetics necessary to produce those commercial herds. So a commercial cow herd owner will go buy bulls from a registered Angus or registered Hereford, whatever breed they choose. That's where they will get their bulls, generally from a registered outfit. And there's a whole bunch of nuances and idiosyncrasies that go with both types of those ranching operations. So I've experienced both of those. I've cowboyed as far south as Texas, and most of my full time cowboy career has been across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. About 10 years ago, my ranching experience, my ranching culture, my ranching life in general changed. Some things that happened in my personal life that put me in a situation where I needed to find a more secure job, find a higher paying job with better insurance. And I ended up with a town job. I sold cars and worked in the automotive industry for a few years. I learned a lot during that time, especially about retail business, about marketing, about networking, and about communication. Next, I had an opportunity to go to work for an at-risk youth organization. It was an academy, a quasi-military academy that took in at-risk youth ages 16 to 19 and helped them kind of get back on their feet, or even if they were not off the right track, just get them better situated to move into adult life as a productive member of society. And that was a very educational job as well, because I got to see some real extremes of the human condition. There was moments within that job that were so inspirational that you cried happy tears. And to this day, I can think back on those memories and watching a troubled youth who figured it out while he was at the academy walk across the graduation stage and into a career as a successful adult. And those make me extremely happy. I have a lot of happy memories and um, strong ties with those kids. But there was also the other side of it. There was the dark side of the human condition, where these kids were coming out of really troubled homes. And we're talking kids that had been exposed to lots of drugs, prostitution, um, violence, domestic abuse. And some of those kids turned around and succeeded and went and made their own lives. And some of them ended up falling into that pattern. And that was something that was really hard. There was some traumatic moments in that job that I learned a lot from, but those have also stuck with me. But during those times where I was working those town jobs, I was still working part-time for agriculture. So I was never really disconnected from natural resources and ranching. But a little over a decade ago, I had the opportunity to go to work for the federal government. At that point in my life, I was still needing to have a secure job with good pay and good health insurance, but I was also going through a divorce, and the flexibility that a government job gave me with my time allowed me to see my kids more. So, since there wasn't really any other ranch jobs in the area at the time that could provide those, I chose to go follow that path that led me into service as a federal employee. That was hard. That was a hard transition to go from ranching in the private sector to being one of the federal employees that ranchers cuss all the time. And I knew that I was going to lose credibility with a lot of my peers. There was going to be a lot of sneers, um, some eye rolling, and there's going to be some just very direct conversation where people basically told me I was an idiot. Most of that did come true. Most of that did happen. Nobody directly told me I was an idiot, but they did say other things. And you know what? It didn't matter. I needed to do what was best for myself and my family at the time. And fortunately, working for the Forest Service allowed me to go into a new culture, a different kind of atmosphere, work atmosphere, and still be involved with the natural resources in this country out here that I love so much. It did educate me. I realized pretty quickly that I had some very strong negative bias, we'll call it, towards federal employees, federal land management agencies. And I'm not going to say that none of that was true. And some of it was very true, but there was a lot of it that was kind of based on ignorance. And once I finally got into federal service and working within the Forest Service, I came to realize that in reality, at least in the part of the Forest Service that I was working in, there was a lot of very good people. There was a lot of people fighting hard to keep ranching on the landscape, even though to the rancher, it seemed like those people were just trying to get rid of their cows, or those people were just trying to make things difficult for them to run their cows. And in some cases, I know that that can be true. But on the forest that I was working on, the people that I worked for, they were very dedicated to keeping ranching on the landscape because they understood the importance of using grazing to manage the natural resources. And we can get into that more at a different time, but suffice it all to say that I learned a lot moving into a different culture from my ranching culture, moving into the government culture, and it hasn't all been bad. And I can honestly say that taking that Forest Service job was probably one of the best life decisions that I've ever made. It opened up a lot of doors for me, but it opened my eyes to a lot of things that I had just dismissed before. Because when you grow up in a certain culture, you grow up a certain way. When everybody in that culture is saying the same negative things about a certain other group of people, it's easy to just accept that as truth. But that doesn't mean it is true. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. What I just said ties into what you hear often about a person's perception is their reality. Well, if a person's perception is their reality, that perception is based on knowledge that they have, right or wrong. It doesn't matter. Their perception is based on the knowledge they have. Their knowledge is based on information that they have consumed. So, if the knowledge that these city folks have of our Western culture is largely inaccurate, it's probably because most of the information that they consume is from Hollywood producers with an agenda and biased news media also with an agenda. How can we expect city folks to have any sort of real concept of our culture and how it affects them if that is the only information that they're consuming? I'm not saying nobody is out there trying to educate these folks, but I think more can be done. And that's where this podcast comes into play. I have a natural knack for storytelling. I've been a storyteller ever since I was a little boy, and I love educating people, and I love learning about new cultures. So, this podcast is a way for me to finally step outside of my own little sphere of understanding and share my story, share my thoughts, my feelings with the greater world. And that's people within my own culture and hopefully people outside of my culture. Sharing the story of the rural American West with people outside of our culture isn't new to me. When I was 7 years old, my father, Ray Marxer, who managed the Matador Cattle Company for 21 years, he worked there for 37, and my mother, who's been by his side for almost that entire time, they took on the opportunity to host bus tours that would come through our part of Montana. And these tours, they were called Worldwide Country Tours. They were owned by the Country Magazine, and later I believe they were owned by Reader's Digest. But these tours, they went all over the place. But this specific tour was called the Big Sky Country Tour, and they would come up from Salt Lake City, Utah, tour around all sorts of places in rural Idaho, and we would meet them at the Monida, Montana border, where my family and I would get on these buses, and then we would spend the entire day riding the bus, talking into a microphone, telling these people about where we live, talking about the landscape, the history, the culture, talking about the characters that have been a part of our lives, and talking about not only the romance and the wonderful parts of life out here, but also the challenges. As a young boy, that was very impactful to watch that, to literally see somebody from outside of our culture, a city person, listen to something that my father was saying, talking about land management or animal management, how wildlife and livestock interact and how they can complement each other with proper management. Things like that, he would say, and you could almost see a literal light bulb come on above these people's head. And they would get this realization that everything that they had known maybe wasn't completely accurate. And man, the questions that they would come up with and ask, even as a young kid, I can remember being stunned by how serious those folks took that and how appreciative they were of learning the story of what we do out here in our culture. We hosted those bus tours for 20 years. I was a grown married adult the last tour that I hosted by myself. And over those 20 years, we impacted hundreds of people. Hundreds of people from outside of our culture came and visited, and they came knowing that they were going to be learning. Most of them came with an open mind. And then those folks returned back to the communities that they lived in with a whole new appreciation for our culture. And I would like to think that they shared that with their families, and that when it came time to vote at a ballot box, regardless of how they believe and how they vote politically, that they at least considered us out here in the West in these tiny little towns without much of a voting population, considered how something might affect us. And I think that's where we are today. This story needs to be shared, because if it's not, that divide between two cultures, the culture of the rural Americans who are primarily involved in production of food and fiber, and the culture of the city folks who are very involved in many other industries. But if they can't grasp or can't have no concept of how we live our lives, they can't appreciate it. And there, as we each retreat to our own little individual corners, protecting our own points of view, there's an ever widening divide and a lack of understanding. And I think we need to work at bridging that. I'm not saying that I'm the answer, but I'm saying something has to be done, and work needs to be done to better communicate. And that's why I'm here. I'm here doing something I've never done before. I didn't really even know what podcasts were till a couple years ago, and I never listened to one until this year. So hosting a podcast is incredibly intimidating to me right now. I've bought the equipment. I've researched podcasting to death. I've um, I've asked for help, for some counsel from folks that have been podcasting for a while, and I have built a studio. I'm trying to set this up to be a professional type production, but I find myself just standing here at the starting line with a little bit of a crippling fear. Like, I can feel the demons of doubt at my door. I'm dealing with some imposter syndrome. I can, you get those voices in your head that try to keep you from doing something good. The voices of nobody cares, nobody's going to listen, you're going to sound like an idiot and embarrass yourself. Uh, your mission doesn't mean anything to most people. Or one of the worst is, well, you're just going to quit anyway, so why even start? Those kind of things have been rolling through my mind and actually causing me to put off recording this episode. I've recorded this introductory episode twice, totally scripted out, wanting to make sure that I did it perfect, that I made the best first impression possible. And I deleted both of them. And now we're talking hours wasted. So here I am, no notes, just talking from the heart, trying to follow some semblance of a cohesive thought through this conversation and let you know what we're what we're going to do with this podcast. So, this podcast is going to be primarily interview and conversation based. This is going to be one of the only episodes where it's just me talking to you. And that's just because it's an introduction episode. In the future, we're going to do interviews that will be both in studio, in person. There are also going to be in-person interviews where they're more remote, where I travel to somebody or travel to an event. I would love for every interview on this podcast to be in person. Unfortunately, I have a full-time job. I have 3 kids. I have an amazing wife that I like to spend time with. I don't even know where I'm going to get the time to put this podcast together. So there, and where I'm going to get the money to do it the way I want to. So until this podcast gets rolling and hopefully we bring in some other funding, the interviews are going to have to be a combination of in-person interviews and then also remote interviews. Like you see them all the time. A lot of times they're through a program like Zoom that people are familiar with. I'll probably use something a little bit better with better sound and better video. Like what I'm on right now is called StreamYard. I'm trying it out. If it's better, that's what we're going to roll with. The podcast is going to be video and audio. Those of you who are watching this on video probably are like, duh. But those of you who are listening to this on audio through any number, through any number of the podcast apps, I want you to know that there's video and you'll be able to find it on YouTube. This podcast is going to have its own dedicated YouTube channel. I have another one that a lot of people know me by, which is called The Adventure Cowboy. It's a whole nother brand. It's another passion project, but it's primarily around the outdoors, classic cowboy firearms and hunting. And there's some ranching stuff in there, but I needed to tell the story on a bigger scale outside of that niche. And that's where this podcast comes from. So if you want to watch the video versions of this podcast, you can find it on YouTube at Living Western _podcast. That's the handle at Living Western _podcast. You can also find us on social media. I've made brand new pages for the podcast. On Instagram, the handle is at Living Western _podcast. And on Facebook, you can find it by simply searching Living Western. Finally, there's a website. The website right now is going to be hosted on adventurecowboy.com/living-western. I do have the domain for the podcast to just have a Living Western site in itself, but right now, adventurecowboy.com/living-western. And on that website, hopefully you'll be able to buy some of the art that's behind me. Those of you who are listening just on audio, I've got a studio built here, and in the background is Western photographs and art. And then even my father's book is up here. It's called Cowboy in a Corporate World. That will be available on the website as well. So what we're trying to do is just have a way for you guys to connect with us outside of just within the podcast. So Living Western is going to be more than just the podcast. It's kind of going to be a brand, but the focus of it is definitely the podcast itself. There's so much more that I want to say. There's so much more that I feel like I need to say, but I don't want to bore you. And I've probably already done that. Suffice all of this to say, I'm really excited about this podcast. I'm nervous, but it's a nervous energy. And I know that if I just take these first steps and I just record the first podcast and just start putting them out there, eventually people are going to see that the intention is honorable. The information is important, critical, you might say. And the stories are well worth hearing. There's going to be stories that come out of this podcast that will change your life for the better. And I just need to share them. I'm so thankful for those of you who are listening right now or watching. Please forgive the ineptitude that I have with starting something new. It's always rough, man. I hate going back and looking at my first YouTube videos. You hear the word cringe, and that word is overused, but man, anytime you first start something and you go back and look someday, those first episodes, those first recordings are cringy. And you just got to get through them. The only way to improve is by doing it. So here we are. This is the story of the rural American West, told through the individual stories of amazing people who call this part of the world home. My name is Clayton Marxer, and you're listening to Living Western.